and thank you for that introduction. As you did say, I will be talking about Iran, Iraq, and Syria and how the this year's 2021 USCIRF report treats these countries. As was done last year, Iran was given a recommendation as a country of particular concern, CPC status. Once again, in my opinion, USCIRF really hit the nail on the head, documenting Iran's egregiously poor and even deteriorating record on religious freedom within this country. But it goes even further, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. The report notes that scores of Christians and other religious minorities continue to be unjustly persecuted, arrested, assaulted, and even imprisoned in Iran for their faith. Interestingly, while apostasy is not expressly codified into the penal code in Iran, the Constitution of Iran clearly mandates that Sharia law should be applied in cases where the penal code is silent on a particular matter. So in that regard, make no mistake, religious persecution is indeed national policy in Iran. Not only is it allowed, it is policy. This year's USCIRF report also notes that popular calls for government reform are violently suppressed by the government, particularly against Christian minorities, religious minorities in general as well. An example of this is women who protest peacefully against government policy mandating headscarves, head covers. They have been arrested and in many cases imprisoned. There have been reports that in many of these cases, in fact, women have been denied legal representation and counsel in these cases. One thing that particularly stood out to me, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier in this year's report, was that USCIRF in their report extends Iran's religious persecution not just to what occurs inside of their borders domestically, but also internationally. That mention alone, in contrast with previous years' reports, it's a great thing because, again, they are acknowledging the role that they play regionally, not just domestically. What would have been really great to see is that if the report specifically named particular locales, particular actors, proxy actors of Iran that carry out its international operations, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. Doing so would better frame the gravity and the impact of religious freedom violations that Iran continues to perpetrate internationally. Some of the recommendations that USCIRF made this year are pretty much mirroring last year's, which are all strong recommendations. Again, CPC status designation, as well as targeted sanctions should be continued and even strengthened. One thing that appeared in this year's report that did not appear in last year's report is the recommendation that the U.S., should it return to the negotiation table with Iran in the future, religious freedom and human rights should be an issue of discussion as a USCIRF recommendation. I'd also go ahead and take it just a little bit further than that and say that should they return to the negotiation table with Iran, Iran's support for proxy actors in the region should also be part of future negotiations. So overall, the Iran chapter was exactly what was expected, strong recommendations and a very keen recognition of some of the issues taking place that affect religious freedom in country. Moving on briefly to Iraq. Overall, the report noted that despite some symbolic achievements in Iraq, the status of religious freedom indeed remains poor. Although ISIS was defeated recently in the last couple of years, that doesn't restore religious freedom for the Christian minorities, particularly in northern Iraq. The displaced Christians and Yazidis, who are genocide survivors, essentially, are reluctant to move back to their ancestral homelands. They do face barriers to their safe return, namely in the Nineveh Plain and Sinjar. And here we're talking about hundreds of thousands of displaced people. According to the report, there are three primary causes to their inhibited return. That is the ever-present fear that ISIS will reconstitute itself, which is a real fear, as we see in the news daily. The fact is these Christians and Yazidis are genocide survivors, as mentioned, and are deeply scarred, and they may never fully recover from their physical as well as emotional harm inflicted upon them in past years. The second cause for the inhibited return is a security threat posed by Iranian-backed militias, primarily the Popular Mobilization Forces, which dominate the area in northern Iraq. These militias harass, even threaten violence and carry out violence against Christian minorities in the Nineveh Plain and in northern Iraq in general. They do so with impunity, despite symbolic efforts by the central Iraqi government to rein them in. And then finally, the third reason is Turkey's continued bombing of Christian and Yazidi towns in northern Iraq, which is still underway, as we see in the news occurring quite frequently. The recommendations made by USCIRF this year, inclusion of Iraq in the State Department's special watch list, as we know, as well as the US government should maintain pressure on the Iraqi government to rein in Iranian-backed militias and enable the safe return of Christian and Yazidi minorities back to their ancestral homelands. The U.S. should impose sanctions on militia leaders who authorize or even allow religious freedom violations in northern Iraq. And then finally, the United States should continue to assist ethno-religious minorities to rebuild their communities in the Nimbo Plain and in Sinjar. And then finally, jump over to Syria. Syria, as it got last year, it received a CPC, country of particular concern recommendation. The USCIRF report correctly notes that religious freedom remains under serious threat in Syria and on multiple fronts. One front of that would be the Turkish-backed jihadist groups that threaten religious minorities in northern Syria. All the while, Turkey itself continues to campaign against what they term terrorist groups in northern Syria through bombing and aerial campaigns, which has devastated Christian communities in northern Syria. Meanwhile, in regime-controlled areas, the Syrian government continues violent crackdowns and human rights violations against its non-combatant citizens, many of whom are Christians. On the flip side, the report notes that the autonomous administration in northeast Syria remains the only region with a strong record of religious freedom and ethnic pluralism, which, as previously mentioned, is under threat by both the Syrian regime and Turkey simultaneously. So the recommendations made by USCIRF with regard to Syria, of course, in addition to the CPC designation, is that the US should continue sanctions against the Syrian government and the leadership of Turkish-backed militias such as the Free Syrian Army. In addition to sanctions, the US should exert significant pressure on Turkey to provide a timeline for withdrawal from Syria and assurances that their Syrian opposition allies will not expand their territory in the northeast. The US should recognize the AANES, that is the autonomous administration in northeast Syria, as a legitimate regional government and demand its inclusion in US peace talks pursuant to Resolution 2254. And then finally, the US should provide a sanctions exemption only to the autonomous administration in northeast Syria, and while still keeping a tight grip on the Assad regime in the regime-controlled territories. So again, the recommendations made with regard to Syria, as well as the observations and recorded, documented instances of religious persecution were right on par with what we expected and what we had hoped for. And so for that regard, we do give USCIRF kudos. With that point, I turn it back to Stephen.